It's 6:31 p.m., January 27th, 1967. Gus Grissom, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force, veteran of both the Mercury and Gemini programs, is lying on his back, 60 feet off the ground, inside a metal capsule roughly the size of a compact car, wearing a full pressure suit, breathing pure oxygen. To his left, Ed White, the first American to walk in space. To his right, Roger Chaffee, 29 years old, never been to space. They are not flying today. The actual mission is 25 days away. This is a routine test. No fuel in the rocket, no pyrotechnic systems armed. Nobody considered this dangerous. In 17 seconds, a spark will ignite beneath Grissom's seat. In less than a minute, all three men will be dead. In this video, we're going to answer three questions. First, how is it possible that three of NASA's most experienced astronauts died in a ground test without ever leaving the launch pad? Second, who knew that capsule was a death trap, and why didn't anyone stop the program? And third, what does Apollo 1 reveal about how complex systems fail, and why this exact story would repeat itself in different forms for decades to come? To understand what happened on January 27, 1967, you need to understand Gus Grissom. Grissom wasn't NASA's most famous astronaut. That was John Glenn. But inside the agency, among engineers and pilots, Grissom was considered the best. Detail-obsessed, relentless, constitutionally incapable of pretending something was fine when it wasn't. In 1961, he became the second American in space, a 15-minute suborbital flight. He survived. Barely. His Mercury capsule's hatch blew prematurely on splashdown in the Atlantic. The capsule sank. Grissom nearly drowned. NASA never fully settled whether he'd made an error or whether the mechanism had simply failed. He carried that uncertainty around his neck for 6 years. When he was chosen to command Apollo 1, the first crewed mission of the program designed to land a man on the moon, it felt like a rehabilitation, a second act. But from day one, Grissom hated that spacecraft. The Apollo 1 capsule was built by North American Aviation, a NASA contractor based in Downey, California. And there was a fundamental problem. The company couldn't keep up with the changes NASA kept demanding. When the capsule was delivered to Kennedy Space Center in August 1966, there were 113 significant engineering changes that still needed to be completed. After delivery, an additional 623 engineering change orders were made and carried out. The capsule arrived as a rough draft, and it stayed a rough draft. Grissom grew so frustrated with the training simulator, which couldn't keep pace with the endless changes to the actual spacecraft, that he walked to his backyard, picked a lemon off a tree, and hung it from the simulator's hatch. A message to anyone willing to read it. This thing is a lemon. The problems were both catastrophic and mundane. A faulty pump in the environmental control system, leaking thrusters, coolant failures, exposed wiring, software that crashed. Grissom told a reporter the problems came in bushel baskets. He said he doubted the 14-day mission would be completed successfully. But there was a pressure pushing everything forward, a pressure with a name. John F. Kennedy.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
In 1961, Kennedy had promised the nation that the United States would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. It was 1967. 3 years left, and the Soviets were ahead. Inside NASA, This atmosphere had a name. The astronauts called it go fever, the culture of pressing forward, of fixing things on the fly, of never stopping, because stopping meant losing the space race. Grissom knew something was wrong, but the fever was stronger. On the evening of January 26, 1967, the day before the disaster, the Apollo 1 backup crew finished their own test. Wally Schirra, one of the original 7 astronauts, climbed out of the capsule and walked directly to Grissom. Schirra was known for being cold, calculated. A man who had flown 3 different space programs without losing his composure once. He looked at Grissom and said only this: "If you get the slightest glitch, anything that feels off, get out of there. I don't like it." Grissom nodded. The next day, at 1 p.m., the 3 astronauts entered the capsule. It was pressurized with 100% pure oxygen, at slightly above sea-level atmospheric pressure. A decision NASA had made years earlier, carried over from Mercury and Gemini. It was technically simpler than managing an oxygen-nitrogen mix. The problem, under those conditions, almost anything burns, and it burns explosively. Inside the capsule, there was Velcro strips everywhere to hold equipment in zero gravity, nylon netting, polyurethane foam padding, paper documentation, a block of styrofoam the crew had brought in themselves to relieve pressure on their backs. Investigators would later describe the interior as a fireplace waiting for a spark. And the communications simply didn't work.
Can't hear.
For hours, the test kept getting halted because controllers in the blockhouse couldn't hear the astronauts clearly. Grissom, furious, said out loud, "How are we going to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" The test was put on hold at 5:40 p.m. 40 minutes later, another attempt. Another failure. At 6:30 p.m. and 54 seconds, sensors registered a brief power surge aboard Apollo 1. 10 seconds later, Roger Chaffee's voice came over the radio. One word. The fire started most likely under Grissom's seat, a wire with damaged insulation, stripped, investigators believed, by the repeated opening and closing of a small access panel, created a spark near a glycol coolant line that had been prone to leaks. In pressurized, pure oxygen, that was enough. The flame spread left to right in less than 17 seconds. The Velcro caught. The nylon caught. The styrofoam exploded like a bomb. Within seconds, the temperature inside the capsule exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. To open the Apollo 1 hatch, the hatch NASA had specifically chosen over one with explosive bolts, deeming it safer, required a 3-step process that took a minimum of 90 seconds. Under perfect conditions, no fire, no internal pressure, full training. The fire had sealed the hatch from the inside. Ed White tried. Investigators found marks on the ratchet mechanism. He had begun turning it before the smoke overtook him. At 6:31:19 p.m., the capsule ruptured. A thick black cloud of smoke poured into the white room of Launch Complex 34. 27 technicians were treated for smoke inhalation that night. 5.5 minutes after the first cry, firefighters managed to open the hatch. What they found inside, lit only by flashlights, was described as a scene from hell. Grissom, White, and Chaffee were dead. Not from burns, from asphyxiation. Carbon monoxide got there first. The nylon pressure suits had melted and fused with the capsule structure. It took hours to remove the bodies. The man who had run to the phone, pad leader Don Babbitt, couldn't find words when he called Deke Slayton, the head of the astronaut office. He just choked. Slayton arrived at the pad a few minutes later. He understood everything without asking a single question. Here's what this story actually reveals. It's not about a frayed wire. It's not about one wrong engineering decision. It's about what happens when an entire organization knows something is wrong and keeps going anyway. Grissom knew. Schirra knew. Backup astronaut Walter Cunningham later admitted, "We knew the spacecraft was in poor shape relative to what it ought to be. We felt like we could fly it, but it just wasn't as good as it should have been." General Samuel Phillips, sent by NASA to inspect North American's facilities in 1965, returned with a scathing report on the company's management and manufacturing standards. The report existed. NASA received it. The program didn't stop. Why? Because the race was more important than the safety. And this would happen again. On January 28, 1986, exactly 19 years and 1 day after Apollo 1, the Space Shuttle Challenger broke apart 73 seconds after launch, killing all 7 crew members. Engineers at Morton Fiacol had warned the night before that the O-ring seal that failed had never been tested at temperatures as low as that morning's. NASA managers overruled them. In 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. A piece of foam had struck and damaged the heat shield during launch. Engineers requested satellite imagery of the orbiter to assess the damage. The request was denied because there was nothing that could be done mid-mission anyway. 7 more astronauts died. Grissom, White, and Chaffee did not die because of a wire. They died because there was a culture that made it impossible to say stop. The post-accident investigation identified not just technical failures, but management failures. NASA had let go fever suppress skepticism. Political urgency had infiltrated engineering decisions. The lesson was learned, but only until the urgency came back. Apollo 1 never flew. But what came next changed history. The program was suspended for 20 months. The capsule was completely redesigned. The hatch was replaced with one that could be opened in 10 seconds. Flammable materials were removed. The ground test atmosphere was changed to an oxygen-nitrogen mix. In October 1968, Apollo 7 launched, with Wally Schirra, the same man who had warned Grissom, as commander. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon. And in August 1971, astronaut Dave Scott landed in the Hadley Apennine Mountains on the lunar surface. Before leaving, he placed a small aluminum figurine and a plaque into the lunar dust. The plaque listed the names of every known U.S. astronaut and Soviet cosmonaut who had died in the pursuit of space exploration. 3 of those names were Grissom, White, and Chaffee. Men who, had the hands of fate turned just a little differently, might have left their own footprints in that alien soil. The Apollo 1 capsule still exists. After the investigation, it was moved to a secured warehouse at NASA Langley in Virginia. It has never been put on public display. And there's something the investigation never fully resolved. They never conclusively identified the exact source of the initial spark. They know where the fire started. They know what fed it. But the precise moment, the spark that changed everything, remains technically unconfirmed. Which means, on some level, the capsule is still keeping it secret. If you made it this far, you now know something most people don't. not just what happened on Pad 34 on January 27, 1967, but why it happened and why it kept happening. The names change, the vehicles change, the decade changes, but the pattern stays the same. A system under pressure, warnings that get ignored, and people who pay the price for decisions they didn't make. If that kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe, hit the bell, because the next video goes somewhere you might not expect. We're going to look at the mission that came right after this one, and the near disaster that almost ended the entire Apollo program before it ever reached the moon. Apollo 13. The full story. The one detail most documentaries leave out.
And there's something the investigation never fully resolved. They never conclusively identified the exact source of the initial spark. They know where the fire started, they know what fed it. But the precise moment, the spark that changed everything, remains technically unconfirmed. Which means on some level, the capsule is still keeping its secret. If you made it this far, you now know something most people don't. Not just what happened on Pad 34 on January 27, 1967, but why it happened and why it kept happening. The names change, the vehicles change, the decade changes, but the pattern stays the same. A system under pressure, warnings that get ignored, and people who pay the price for decisions they didn't make. If that kind of story is what you're here for, subscribe, hit the bell, because the next video goes somewhere you might not expect. We're going to look at the mission that came right after this one, and the near disaster that almost ended the